Hello world, my name's Kyle Fischl. This is going to be episode 207 of my poker vlog. For those of you that are newer to the channel, I would usually say we are back, and that typically derived from a long time ago when I was playing poker 1-2, 2-5 struggling player. I would often say we are back. Following a losing session, we made all the money back and we're back. So that's kind of where that came from. I'm not saying it here because I'm gonna somewhat quickly tell you one of the most devastating bad beats I've taken across my poker career. If you're uninterested in this little story time, you can click here to go right to the poker hands. I was wrapping up a session at the Bonita Springs Poker Room. I booked probably an $1,800 win, definitely above average, a very strong session. And when I was driving home, approximately 1 a.m., my car started to hydroplane and crashed into a barrier on the highway. Naturally, I stepped out of my car to observe the damage, seeing if my car was still drivable, everything was fine, and I only saw the left side of it at that point and thought my car was actually fine. It didn't feel like too big of a hit, and it didn't seem like anything was too out of line to be able to make it home. I was actually on the phone with my wife at the time, obviously hands-free, cars connect to your phones, wasn't like holding it there, talking on the phone, and she heard everything. I go to straighten my car out because it was kind of dark, couldn't see anything, just basically pitch black on the corner of a highway. Then when I get it lined up on the shoulder, my wife, tells me to call the insurance company, call the police, all that jazz. And as that process is getting through, I start looking through my belongings, making sure everything's okay. And that's the point where I realized that I left my entire bankroll on my lap as I was driving home. Not something I do standardly, but it was raining, I was in a rush, definitely wet and a less than standard operating procedure by myself. So that's about 1 a.m. in the rain. I'm walking up and down the highway in the tall grass looking for a large substantial amount of cash, a little over $4,000 in cash, somewhere lost along the highway, desperately trying to find it, as that is the amount of money that is kind of significant towards me. Eventually the cop pulls up and he sees the damage, asks me a bunch of questions about the crash and everything, but he will not allow me to continue searching. It's dark, it's raining. For my own safety, I can't just be looking through the grass on the side of a highway at 1 in the morning. Okay, reasonable, I suppose. It's at this point where I see the total damage to my car, which I won't show all of it here because YouTube has weird rules about hazardous or dangerous materials being shown, so I'm just going to show you the stuff that I think is less severe. The next day, bright and early, me, my wife, my parents, we're all along the highway looking for around $4,000 to $5,000 in cash, and green money sitting somewhere in tall grass is somewhat difficult to find, it turns out. And because it was dark and raining, and when you're in a crash, not all the information's very clear to you at the time. If you've ever been in a very serious car crash, things are kind of a blur a little bit. Basically what I'm saying is somewhere between mile marker 121 and 123, there is a bunch of cash laying around on the northbound side.
Want my treasure? You can have it. I left everything I gathered together in one place. Now you just have to find it.
All joking aside, I'm not encouraging anyone to go search the highway for that money. That is dangerous. And in reality, I just assume either the cop or the tow truck driver or any of the several other cars which also seem to spin out in the same spot as mine, so I don't know what was wrong with the road. Someone must have found it by now, which is quite unfortunate for me. My news would continue to get bad as my car would be deemed a total loss, and having all that occur in the midst of a move is quite a lot of issues to deal with at the same time. I did not film myself at the crash, walking up down the highway in the dark, any of that, because if you've been viewing the channel for a while, I don't typically put life stuff in the channel. I think this is directly made for poker, but when you end up losing your entire poker bankroll for ridiculous reasons, that one I think is worthy of being documented for the vlog. And with that, the video after this one will be the beginning of a small bankroll builder challenge for myself. I have lost my bankroll playing poker several times, it happens, and give you some tips and tricks on how to build your bankroll to be in a comfortable state to be able to battle against your competitors in a more regular and aggressive manner. And with all that out of the way, let's talk about some poker hands. First hand of note, we head straight into the 2-5 game today, and we look down at 8-9 of clubs from the button. When we button straddle, there is one limp. The hijack raises to $25, and then it's on me. I actually really consider 3-betting this one specifically. 8-9 suited is one of the better candidates we have for our weaker 3-betting that gives us a little more board coverage. Additionally, with one limp, the raiser only made it 25, so very, very small raise. I think attacking this size specifically would be a very good spot, but we just sat down. No need to get too out of line off rip. So I make the call. The limper makes the call as well. So we end up going 3 ways to a flop, where I'm immediately punished for not 3-betting. 8-6-3 with 2 clubs is the flop. Kicking myself for not pushing the action, but when it checks to the pre-flop aggressor, he bets $25. Sometimes when you consider doing an aggressive line but then choose the passive route instead, it gives you more incentive to choose an aggressive line later in the hand. So we're going to choose to take that aggression right now. Top pair and a flush draw is good enough to raise here. Raising definitely punishes my opponent when they just c-bet with random ace highs and Broadway holdings, because some people believe that they should just c-bet when they're the pre-flop aggressor, even when the board doesn't really connect with them and really should not be c-bet. They just think they should anyway since they're the aggressor. So we want to punish those types of hands. We make it $75. The other player in the hand folds, and now the pre-flop aggressor decides to min click it back to 125. When he puts these chips in the middle, I can see it's clearly a min click, and the table thinks that it's just a call. But after a bit of confusion is sorted out, it is $125 to call, 50 more than the 75 I have already invested. I think 4-bet getting it in here is just terrible. I think my opponent has like 9s, 10s, all the way up to queens. Don't think 2 over and flush cards are doing a 3-bet on this one, especially out of position. Think those hands are pretty happy to just call when they face a raise. Even if he had like ace, king, no clubs, I think that just calls some of the time. It doesn't really min 3-bet it back to really see where they're at. So this really just feels like 10s or jacks to me a lot of the time. I'm going to call here. I have tons of equity. A 9 would be pretty good and a club. But when the turn is the ace of spades and my opponent checks to me, I think he's given me a lot of evidence that he had a middling pocket pair between 8s and kings. So we're going to pile in money here. If I had like ace high clubs, I would definitely bet this card. So with the 8-9 of clubs, we're going to bet as well. Try to get those middling pocket pairs to fold now that they've bloated the pot out of position and had a devastating turn card. I announced 250 and my opponent folds before I even get the money into the middle. So curious to see what you guys think on this one. What does a min flop 3-bet typically mean? Have you ever seen one before? I'm interested to see what the world thinks of this one. On the next hand of note, folds to me in the cutoff, I have ace of hearts, queen of spades, and I make it $20. To this bet, the button makes it 65. Now, normally in live 2-5 games, 3-bets are very rare and very nutted, but this player in particular had 3-bet probably 3 times in 4 laps of poker, highest percentage I've ever seen at a 2-5 game, as well as he's played 100% of hands from the button. So paying attention to all this, given the fact that it's also cutoff versus button, player with a high 3-bet percentage, I give this 3-bet 0 credibility. And when that happens, that leads us to a mandatory 4-bet, I think.
Don't try it.
Ace queen offsuit, not my favorite candidate for the 4-bet, but here we are.
You underestimate my power.
I make it $200. When my opponent calls, as the dealer's pulling the chips in the middle, I've already made up my mind that I will be c-betting this board almost no matter what it is. But it turns out to be queen 6-7 with 2 hearts. We end up flopping top, which is pretty good. I think my opponent would happily 5-bet or get it in with kings or aces. So actually believing that I got extremely lucky on this flop against exactly ace, king, or pocket jacks, I'm still going to c-bet, down-bet it significantly, 125, almost a quarter pot. Having the ace of hearts makes it almost impossible for my opponent to have a flush draw besides, I don't know, king jack of hearts specifically. So should be well ahead of my opponent on this one, and to the $125 bet, my opponent pretty quickly folds. So the 4-bet bluff hand works for us on this time. Kind of happy I didn't get just snap 5-bet ripped and have to just sacrifice the $200 for a ill-timed little experiment. Following that, we look down at pocket 8s from the cutoff. When the hijack makes it $20, I choose to just call this one. Small blind and big blind decide to call, so I'm going 4 ways to a flop, which is 8-6 deuce with 2 hearts. We bink a set, top set no less. Hopefully someone has 9s plus and they'll pay me off huge, but it checks all the way to me. I'm going to half pot this one. Think any of my opponents can have 2 overs that won't fold to just a single half pot size bet. Think they won't fold any 9s plus, any 2 diamonds. So I bet $40 into the 80, and one by one, everyone folds.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
So this is probably the most wasted set I've ever had. Can't get any money in the middle when we flop the nuts. But that's okay. We look down at ace queen of hearts from the +1 position. I make it $15. The player to my direct left 3 bets to $40. So further evidence of his very high 3-betting rate. Doesn't actually mean he's playing bad, like you should be either 3-bet or folding. That would be just good poker. But when a late position player and a small blind decides to call the 40, it's back on me. I'm in kind of an interesting spot. We've only been at this table for like an hour at this point. Am I about to 4-bet 2 times in an hour? I think there's 120 in dead money out there. None of the players behind should have a super strong hand. This player's been 3-betting a lot, so could a 4-bet to like 200, 250 get all 3 players to fold and we just get to take down the dead money? We'll never know, because after a bit of tank, I actually choose to call. Feel like after my last hand, I'm going to get looked up super light or even 5-bet bluffed into. And when I call the 40, the flop is 7-5-3 with 2 hearts. So we flopped enough flush draw. Again, actually running extremely, extremely hot today. This one's definitely going to be a check raise if my opponent decides to c-bet this one. 2 overs and a flush draw. I'm doing almost a pure 50-50 against 9s plus. Any pocket pair I have a ton of equity against, so we're going to push the action on this one. But it checks all the way through. Alright, I'll do the betting myself on the turn. But the turn is the king of hearts. When everyone had an open betting lead on the flop and no one took it, I can't imagine anyone's too strong here. I don't want to check because I think she's going to check through again, and we need to build the pot a little bit. So we're going to bet super small here, hoping that a random king will do a crying call because the obvious flush is completed. Maybe even a 7 or ace 6, 4, 5, things like that will continue for 1 bet. To the $40 bet, only a later position player decides to call, the other 2 players fold. So we end up going heads up to a river card, which is the 10 of clubs. It's nice that the nuts have not changed. It's going to be hard to get paid here because he can't even have like a king or a queen high flush. The best flush he could have is jack 10 specifically. But if I had the ace of hearts only, I would bet relatively big here. If you've watched my channel, I've put a lot of money in with just single nut flush blockers. So we're going to bet relatively big when we have the nut flush. I make it $160 and my opponent pretty much snap folds. So maybe he had a single jack of hearts. Maybe he just had a small pair and just didn't want to fold for 40. But 160 is too much for him. We are 4 for 4 so far on this day. On the next fun hand of poker, it folds all the way to the button who makes it $20. I'm in the small blind. I'm actually having a conversation at the time. And I make it 55 when I have ace king, ace of spades, king of diamonds. Obviously meant to do 65. Live action misclick. Not too common, but it is what happened. I actually say out loud that I misclicked. And maybe that enticed my opponent to raise again because he makes it $150.
What is going on? And where's Andy? And what is going on?
My opponent in this hand is on the tighter side. I don't know if I induced this action or if he really has a hand. We both have over $1,200 effective, so I think it'd be kind of a mistake to get over 200 big blinds in pre against a tighter opponent, especially with the offsuit version of this hand. So I make the call, playing out of position, not ideal, but we end up going heads up to a flop, which comes 10-9-4 with 2 spades. Having the ace of spades and it being a 10 high board with multiple backdoor draws and overs, we're not going to fold to a single c-bet if my opponent chooses to do it. But when I check, my opponent checks it back, so pretty happy to see a free turn card, which is the 7 of clubs. Now I think this board heavily favors me. In a 4-bet pot, I think my opponent just has like ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack a lot of the time. Even though it's not the cleanest flop in the world, I still expect jacks plus to put out a c-bet in a 4-bet pot on the button a high percentage of the time, so I think my opponent just has a weaker ace X here almost always. So we're going to actually bet $75 here. I would do this if I had a random 10, if I had a 9, if I had pocket jacks, 9, 8, pocket 8s, and ace king. This is actually a value bet in my mind. I'm wanting a call here and thinking that I have the best hand. And when my opponent calls, the river is the king of hearts. How often does my opponent have king queen exactly. Not too often. I think my opponent just has ace high. So we're going to go small in relation to the size of the pot. Think that it's hard for my opponent to put me on a hand here, especially with the verbal misclick pre and the flop and turn shenanigans. I think it's hard for my opponent to range me. He might just talk himself into calling a $160 river bet. Additionally, I've won a lot of hands today and shown down none of them. I do think my opponents are going to eventually get curious, and maybe this will be the time for a super light ace high call down, but my opponent settles on a fold. We take another hand down and continue to show no hands on this session. If you watch my vlog for a while, I often just put a clip of the dealer pushing me chips and say a hand was less notable. I'm going to go over 2 less notable hands here that typically don't actually make the final cut. But I have king queen of diamonds from the hijack. I make it $20 and the button and the big blind call. So I'm going 3 ways to a flop, which comes 5-3 deuce with 2 spades. I am pretty much done with this hand. I missed. It's fine to just check fold. When it checks to me, I check. Button checks it back. Turn is the queen of spades. Cool. We turn top pair. Should be the best hand here. I bet $20. My opponents are just going to have a ton of trash here. Too much to even count or go over. So hopefully they just have one of these trash hands that'll pay off $20. And one opponent decides to call. Heads up to a river card, which is the jack of hearts. So not the greatest one. We lose to queen jack, which is one of the hands I'm hoping to get value from. But maybe my opponent has ace jack 1 spade, ace 5 1 spade, 4-5, any of that stuff. I bet small hoping to get called, but for $25 my opponent folds and we take down a less notable pot. Before we get into the next one, where I have ace 10 offsuit from under the gun, I make it $20. 1 late position player and the big blind size of call. So again, we are 3 ways to a flop, which comes ace king 3 with 2 diamonds. With no diamonds in my hand and a marginal ace, we're going to want to check a whole lot more when we're out of position than in position. So out of position 1 player, when it checks to me, I check, happily check call against any diamond draw, any king, worst aces, tons of stuff. But on this one, the flop checks through. The turn is the 4 of spades. When it checks to me, we're going to bet here. The weakest aces, strong kings, middling pocket pairs will all pay off a $30 bet, as well as diamond draws and maybe queen jack, jack 10 at some frequency will pay off this bet, thinking their gut shot's going to be good, because it usually will be. To this $30 bet, only the later position player decides to call, so we're heads up to a river card, which is the 10 of spades. We bink 2 pair, although we kind of didn't want to. Don't really expect my opponent to have ace, queen, ace, jack almost ever. I think a lot of those hands would have bet the flop, and my opponent did not. So really the only hand I think I get value from is king 10 exactly, which is kind of hard as I block the 10. But sometimes players are just really, really sticky. So I put out $55 hoping to get called, but my opponent makes the fold pretty quickly. We win 3 more small and medium hands, less of note, just like the last 2 gone over, before we arrive at the final hand of note. In the big blind, I look down at ace king offsuit. The under the gun player raises to $15 and it folds all the way to me. I choose a relatively standard size, about 3x, would be 45, but we're going to go 50 for a dealer-friendly, easily calculable hand later on. To this $50 bet, the under the gun player makes the call, so we're heads up to a flop, which is ace 9-3 rainbow. So top, this is a spot where we're either way ahead or way behind. If my opponent has like queen jack, he has like 4% to win. If he has pocket 3s, he has 96% chance to win. So very way ahead, way behind spot. Out of position, we're going to do a whole lot of checking. I check it here, hoping that the queen jack type hands that would just fold to any C bet might stab themselves with almost no equity. And any aces and single 9s will probably bet themselves. So we're not even missing out on value when we check here. When I check, my opponent checks it back. The turn is the queen of clubs. I very much hate this card. I do think my opponent has ace queen some of the time. And queen 9, jack 10. A lot of hands pick up a ton of equity on this card, but I'm really just worried about ace queen. Because this is what I consider a pretty bad turn card, I decide to check to my opponent again, see what he wants to do. He'll definitely stab now if he has king queen, queen jack, jack 10. As I've severely underrepped my hand, and my hand looks a lot like pocket 10s, pocket 8s, things like that, which single queen holdings might even feel their value betting against. And when I check, my opponent bets $65. I'm happily going to check call here. That's kind of the plan that we're going to go with this specific hand on this specific board. When I call, the river is the king of clubs. Brings backdoor clubs. We do have the ace of clubs, so we're not really worried about flushes. Brings jack 10, but we're ahead of ace queen now. I check as I don't have the betting lead. I'm actually right now considering if I'm going to raise or not when my opponent bets. I don't know if it's too thin to raise here, targeting exactly ace, queen, king, queen. I do think there's enough combinations of those hands that will pay off a raise and bet themselves on this river. But my opponent interrupts my contemplation by checking. So I just announce 2-pair, roll it over, know that I'm good here. But, oh no, not this time. My opponent has pocket nines.
What?
So on this way ahead, way behind spot, we were in the way behind category. And luckily post-flop, we only lost a single bet of $65, which easily could have resulted in upwards of $800 to $1,000 going the other way if different lines were chosen by either player. So happy to just escape with this one for basically nothing. And with that, we are into the game for $1,000, out of the game for $1,725, which is a profit of $725 across 3 hours, equates to $240 an hour, or 48 big blinds an hour. Yeah, this session I actually thought I played a lot better than I normally do. I typically watch a video and edit it and see like dozens and dozens of mistakes and things I wish I would have done differently and horrible sizes here and there, but apart from straight up misclicking on a 3-bet, I think that everything I did was actually shockingly good in this video specifically. You know, 4-betting ace queen off, which is not really a super standard line, but one we get to work out, and playing a little bit more aggressively than normally is definitely going to be a recipe for a win. If you made it all the way to this point, I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to all my rambling on this video, and I will see you on the next one.